Look out, she's tipping.
Gigantic disaster right in the middle of downtown Chicago.
The vessel was doomed.
He never forgot the sight of all the babies floating on the water.
The people who went into the water almost had no chance.
Can you imagine the number of funerals that had to happen? 844 bodies?
He lost his faith in God that day.
She cut through the Great Lakes faster than any ship in her day. But she also pierced the hearts of Chicago families, leaving wounds that have lasted for generations. She was the excursion ship Eastland, very similar to the Great Lakes steamer Keewatin, which stands behind me as a maritime museum here in Douglas, Michigan. Good evening, I'm John Calloway, and welcome to Chicago Stories. The accident aboard the Eastland took place July 24th, 1915. She was docked in the Chicago River, just off the lakefront. What happened led to the deaths of 844 people. It wiped out 22 families entirely. It was to become the worst disaster in the history of Chicago, with a loss of life exceeding even the Great Chicago Fire. Most of the victims were young women and children who had been invited to enjoy a leisurely boat trip and summer picnic. But the day soon turned tragic aboard a ship that never left the dock. By 1915, Chicago had more than risen from the ashes of the Great Chicago Fire. Skyscrapers soared above traffic and rickety Model Ts parked at the lakefront. The Art Institute and Lincoln Park Zoo attracted families who came to enjoy the good life prosperity promised them. And on the city's far southwest side, the hard-working people of the Western Electric Company were bringing the 20th century into America's homes. The enormous factory was one of the area's largest employers. Western Electric straddled the border between Chicago and a part of suburban Cicero known as Hawthorne.
Everybody's had somebody in their family who worked at Western Electric. It was uncles, cousins, nephews, nieces.
They were you and me. They were everybody. They were Polish, they were Bohemian, they were Italian, they were Irish, they were Swedish, they were Germans. They came from all over the world to find a job, to find a better place to live. And these people worked long, long hours at Western Electric. Heavens, they didn't get free days just every day. These were six-day work weeks that they put in.
And on Saturday, July 24th, 1915, their hard work would be rewarded with an excursion across the lake to a grand company picnic at Washington Park in Michigan City, Indiana.
They had sporting events planned, track events, baseball, softball. They had parades planned.
A day of merriment. It was a gala day.
We were all dressed in white for the parade we were to be in when the boat reached Michigan City. Josephine Plivka, passenger.
So many people brought their families. It was a great opportunity to have good food, good time. George Sindler was a foreman at Western Electric. My great-great-grandmother is George's sister. George had a wife, Josephine. They had 5 children: Adela, Sylvia, George Jr., Albert, and William. It was his parents that came to this country looking for a better life.
My grandmother was almost 14 years old, and she was with her younger sister, Solveig, who was almost 9, and they were with their mother and their Uncle Olaf, who was an employee of Western Electric. They had their picnic basket packed and full of lots of cookies and sandwiches and juices and so forth.
I was with my brother-in-law who worked at the Western, and my sister and I, the 3 of us.
This was a time for excitement because they had very ordinary lives. To be traveling across Lake Michigan at 15 miles an hour was high adventure.
Tickets were distributed to Western Electric foremen, who in turn sold them to their subordinates at 75 cents each. That morning, 7,000 people took streetcars, the L, horse-drawn wagons, or walked in groups to the Clark Street dock along the Chicago River.
On our way, we stopped to visit our neighbor friends, the Zesteras. Their mother said, "You girls are late. My girls left long time ago." Josephine Plifka.
Western Electric Hawthorne Works chartered 5 ships for the excursion to Michigan City. The first to board, the Eastland, a slender steamship built for speed.
There's a pleasure you feel from the nose to the keel of the boat, Eastland. When on land it is hot, there's a cool breezy spot on the boat, Eastland.
Without a doubt, the Eastland was the slickest, neatest, most glamorous ship at that time sailing on the Great Lakes.
The Eastland had many nicknames. One of them was called the Speed Queen of the Lakes. Another one, as it went to Cleveland, was called the Aristocrat of the Lakes. And I think it was labeled in such a fashion to get people excited about it.
But she had other nicknames as well. William J. Wood, a naval architect, said the Eastland was the crank of the lakes, an unflattering nautical term for instability earned after several near accidents.
The reputation of the Eastland was that of being a cranky, unstable, top-heavy ship. Numerous times on Lake Michigan, a couple times on Lake Erie, full of passengers where it would list, bring on water onto the decks.
In 1912, with a nearly full load of passengers from Cleveland, the Eastland listed so heavily to port, capsizing was averted only when the crew forced passengers to move to the starboard side to help the ship regain its balance. The Eastland was built in 1903, the first and only passenger steamer built by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company of Port Huron, Michigan. The company made its reputation building bulk cargo ships.
Other vessels built by the Jenks shipyard had similar characteristics. However, they were freight vessels, and the freight vessels carried their cargoes down low in the holds, whereas the Eastland carried its passengers up high on the top decks.
She had too many bulky upper decks, built for the accommodation of large holiday throngs, but only adding to the dangers of overloading. Fred Kelsey, passenger.
Over the years of service, there were several modifications that even made it less stable. There were dozens of tons of concrete added to the upper decks of the Eastland to shore up the rotting wood. There were tons of weight added with additional lifeboats.
After the Titanic sank in 1912, maritime law was changed to mandate lifeboats for all aboard passenger ships. At the time, the Eastland was licensed to carry 2,000 passengers. But the Eastland's owners, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, were able to convince Steamboat Inspector Robert Reed that they had added more than enough lifeboats to comply with the new law. They claimed that the Eastland was safely equipped to carry even hundreds more passengers. On July 10, 1915, just 2 weeks before the Western Electric picnic, Robert Reed amended the Eastland certificate, allowing her to carry 2,500 passengers and a crew of 75.
Steamboat inspectors had their, I don't want to say hands tied, but if the owner requested an increase and the owner was able to put life rafts and lifeboats on the vessel, then they would be able to have the increases in passenger capacity.
In 1915, the Eastland was having a terribly slow season. The passenger totals rarely went above 500. Often the ship sailed less than a quarter full. The Western Electric picnic was her chance to help the Eastland's owners recoup the losses from the drizzly summer of small crowds.
There is speculation that the owner of the shipping company wanted to increase the number of lifeboats in advance of the regulatory requirements to increase the number of passengers that could be carried to accommodate the picnic goers.
On Saturday morning, July 24th, the excursion to Michigan City would test the Eastland as never before. It marked the first time the Eastland would carry her newly increased limit of 2,500 passengers, plus 33 tons in additional weight of the new concrete deck and lifeboats. Despite these modifications, her owners never checked to see if these increases in weight topside also increased the chances that the Eastland could roll over. Nor did the Eastland's captain, Harry Peterson, follow the advice of William J. Wood, a naval architect familiar with the Eastland's fragile balance. Wood had cautioned that the Eastland's ballast tanks should remain filled at all times. But Captain Peterson had a long-standing policy of pumping out the ballast tanks before loading. This action would raise the gangplank and make it easier for passengers to board. Peterson never changed this standing order, even after the additional weight was added topside. At 6:15 a.m., crewmen began emptying the Eastland's ballast tanks. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson supervised the process. Erickson was an experienced seaman. He had managed water ballast systems aboard ferries on the Great Lakes, a job that involved keeping the ferry balanced while automobiles and rail cars lumbered on and off. But this was his first season aboard the Eastland. Shortly after 6:30 a.m., less than an hour before the Eastland was scheduled to cast off, the crowd began building. 17-month-old Ed Hugh Schultz, Little Eddie, was brought by his parents, Uncle Joseph and Aunt Sabina.
Sabina was probably the most excited of everyone. She was lots of fun, and being pregnant was not going to deter her from enjoying this day.
James Novotny, a cabinet maker, and his wife Agnes dressed their 7-year-old son Willie in a new suit for the occasion. Together with his 8-year-old sister Mamie, the Novotnys walked to the streetcar stop and soon joined the growing crowd on the dock.
When they got to the pier, they were stunned. They had not expected thousands of people, and now it was beginning to drizzle.
It wasn't a bright day for a picnic. It was kind of misting, and the boat was a little bit slippery.
There were just so many people on board. There really wasn't much room just to sort of mill about. A lot of people had started on the lower deck, but it was so crowded people would go up another level, find some seating where they could, and put down their picnic baskets.
We went through the hold of the boat, the bottom, and then we walked maybe about 15 steps, and then we were on the deck.
It's a damn shame to crowd those people on one boat, I said to the ticket taker at the gangplank. It's overcrowded now. Oh, I don't think so, replied the ticket taker. There are not really 1,000 people on board, but those that are all on deck. And that's why it looks so overcrowded. James McCullum, passenger.
There were only 2 people watching the people get on deck. We don't know if they counted the children as they got on. There could have been 2,700 people on the ship.
I never saw the Eastland loaded so heavily as it was Saturday morning, and I've seen her depart many times. Adam Weckler, City Harbor Master.
At 6:53 a.m., Chief Engineer Erickson noticed the inclinometer, a plumb bob device, showed the ship listing to port, toward the river, as passengers crowded the port side rail. Immediately, he opened the valve on the number 2 ballast tank and the C valve on the starboard side. The ballast tank had no gauge to precisely measure how much water had been added. Soon, the ship swung over and listed to starboard, back toward the dock.
My great-grandmother had said that she did not like the feel of the ship, that it felt very unsteady at the time, and at the time it was listing back and forth. She knew that something was wrong. The music was playing at the time the people were boarding. I know there were a lot of young people who did go up and start dancing.
I heard the order given. Get all on this boat you can. The others will be overcrowded, and we don't want to leave anybody. The list became more pronounced. There was a sudden hush. James McCullum.
12 minutes later, Captain Peterson ordered the engine room to stand by and phoned Erickson. The ship listed back to port. Another starboard tank was opened. Erickson sent crewmen to move passengers to the starboard side. Other crewmen stood at the stern, ready to cast off lines. Peterson paused.
he started to order the ballasts back in the tanks. He knew something was happening, but it was really too late.
The list grew.
I heard some of the men from the warehouses saying, "Look out, she's tipping."
At 7:28, the lines which held the Eastland to the pier snapped.
I heard glass breaking, and all these chairs were folding up.
People were sliding off the sloping deck, trying to hang on. Furniture was falling. Even a piano fell off the ship.
In an instant, those who were not gripping the starboard rail were slipping down the deck. I ran through the upturned side of the ship, calling to others to follow me. But my cry was drowned in a chorus of screams. E.W. Slatke, passenger.
Most of the noise, most of the screaming and shouting came from those that were along the bridge, those that were in the buildings lining the Chicago River, because they were in a position where they were watching all this happen right in front of them.
I put my forearm up, and my sister was able to grasp it. And then somebody boosted me over the railing.
The crew jumped off before some of the people did. They knew it, the crew knew it, and then the people unfortunately started to find out the hard way when it totally rolled over.
A woman fell off the rail into the water. I jumped in after her. In less than a second, they began dropping in all around me. One hit me on the shoulders and drove me under again. Harry Miller, deckhand.
People were struggling in the water, clustered so thickly that they literally covered the surface of the river. A few were swimming, the rest floundered about, clutching at anything that they could reach. Screaming. The screaming was the most horrible of all. Helen Ruppel, nurse.
There was nothing like chivalry. The stronger dragged down the weaker into the water and usurped their places. Oh, if the men had only been as brave as the women. Joe Lannon, rescuer.
Actually, it didn't matter if you could swim, because if someone was pulling you under, that wasn't going to help you at all.
I saw one woman clinging to a board put her baby on a folded chair and push her off into the river. As the current carried the child away, she threw a kiss at it, and it sank. Charles Carroll, passenger.
People on the pier were tossing things into the river for them to hold on to.
People were throwing in crates from the wharf. People were trying to save other people's lives by throwing things in the water.
In a lot of cases, they were throwing things on top of the people, and they weren't really helping.
There was a woman that Uncle Olaf was trying to save and pull her up. He looked over and he could see his sister starting to go down. And sadly, he did have to let go of that woman in order to save his sister. The whole experience was just awful, and I think you do what you have to do.
The people who went into the water almost had no chance.
Passengers on the starboard side of the top deck were the lucky ones. Instead of being pitched into the water, many climbed over the railing and walked across the overturned hull to safety on a makeshift bridge of tugboats. But hundreds of those who had stayed below deck after boarding drowned or were slowly crushed to death, suffocating under the weight of their fellow passengers.
As soon as the boat settled on its side, muffled cries and pounding of those inside could be heard by the rescuers. Firemen clambered up the slippery hull and with axes started chopping through the sides, while others armed with crowbars and sledges attempted to pry loose the steel plates below the waterline. The New York Times.
We were close to a porthole when we were standing, and I looked down and I could see people kind of grasping for something. I don't know, but I could see the faces. They were scary because I knew that they must have been struggling and probably in water already. And that was kind of a sad sight.
They got some portholes on her upper side open. Passengers who were caught in the cabins on the top side of her were being taken out. They were told to put their arms through the ports first and then to narrow themselves in so they could be pulled out. It was a tight squeeze for some. Harry Miller.
Iron workers nearby, including Elmer Nelson, grabbed acetylene torches and began cutting into the Eastland's hull.
He had been working at another building that Saturday morning, and with his gear, he was instructed by police and firemen to cut holes in strategic spots, and started doing that. And that's when the captain came up and confronted him. It was a yelling match, like an umpire with a baseball player, and they went back and forth with the captain trying to stop him, and my grandfather insisting that he cut holes as soon as possible so that people could come out.
2 women, their clothes in shreds, their fingers torn and bleeding from the clawing at the iron hull of the overturned steamer, were taken alive this afternoon from the interior of the Eastland. They had been imprisoned in a stateroom when the boat turned over. The imprisoned air held back the first rush of water, which, however, seeped in gradually. The 2 women heard the shrieks of the drowning, but the door of their stateroom was pinned fast, and the porthole was too small for them to crawl through. Gradually, the air leaked out, and the water seeped in. First it swirled about their feet and soon rose to their knees. Then it rose to their necks. They heard the blows of sledgehammers above their heads for a time, but these ceased as the rescuers realized that they could make no impression on the steel hull. Rescuers got acetylene torches, and the blue flame began to ease through the steel plates. Just as the water reached the heads of the victims, the iron plate fell in, and the rescuers seized the choking and gasping women by the hair and dragged them out. The New York Times.
Peter Hoffman, the Cook County coroner, awarded stars to those who made repeated rescues.
Martin Jeffers, a bridge tender, was in his post, saw the Eastland roll over right in front of him, came down immediately, went in the water and started rescuing people. And he received a star from the coroner's office.
So did Elmer Nelson, one of the iron workers who confronted Captain Peterson.
The first thing it symbolizes is the heroism of my grandfather. It reminds me of his sacrifice being there for 3 days and rescuing people. And he proudly carried the star in his wallet, and he would tell a story on a front porch or talking to a fellow worker, and it had a real impact on his life.
Doctors used a resuscitating device called a lung motor to pump air into the unconscious. The pump wheezed repeatedly and gave doctors hope that an eyelid would flutter or a chest might heave. The river was so heavily polluted with raw sewage and garbage, Chicago's health commissioner feared an outbreak of typhoid and other diarrheal infections. The health department set up more than 50 stations where anyone who had gone into the river could get free vaccinations. Across the river, where a large clock ticked off each minute of the catastrophe, the Reed Murdoch warehouse became a temporary hospital.
Sabina was pulled from the river. She was still alive, but she died not long afterward. She was fond of saying that she was going to live to be 100, and she was 21. John, Verna, and Ed Jew clung together, and they were found after 2 days. Frank never forgot the sight of all the babies floating on the water, and he lost his faith in God that day.
It was strange how many of them drowned, hanging tight to some object below water. I'd feel around in the water until my pike hooked something. I got so I could tell if it was a body. I'd get the pike hooked in their clothing, fetch them up. My mate would tie a rope around them, men would pull him out. Harry Miller.
There were more than 500 on my side of the boat at the time, and many of them must have drowned. John Morey, passenger.
Crewmen aboard tugboats, barges, and other vessels that filled the Chicago River with a constant flow of traffic saw a man dressed in an Uncle Sam costume thrashing just below the surface. Herman Kraus believed he was saved largely because of what he wore.
As he was floundering in the water and he was starting to drown, the rescuers looked over and said, "Save Uncle Sam. We cannot let Uncle Sam drown." And they grabbed him and pulled him out of the water, and that suit saved his life.
8 divers put on bulky suits and helmets. They jumped into the murky Chicago River with an air hose and a rope attached to them. These lifelines sometimes intertwined and followed the divers into the hold like crossed fingers. A net was stretched across the river at Randolph Street to catch victims being pulled by the current.
Clubs, threats, and the combined authority of the mounted squad had absolutely no effect on the horde of stunned humanity that clung to the guard ropes like limpets and peered down from every vantage point afforded by open windows of the big warehouses that lined the waterfront. Up the slippery wet side, canvas was spread, that those carrying out the bodies might bring out their gruesome freight at a dog trot, and thus empty the overturned basketful of human beings more quickly. The only time the processional stopped was when the stretchers gave out, and we had to sit by and wait for the string of empties to be returned from the shoreline. I wondered dully why they waited for stretchers at all. All the bodies carried past were so rigid that poles to carry them seemed superfluous, and the pitiful shortness of most of them. Children, and yet more children. And when it wasn't a child, it was a young girl of 18 or so. Gretchen Crone, Chicago.
The fact that there were many young children, many single women on board the Eastland probably had a lot to do with the grief that was experienced afterward.
Everything oozed moisture. The bodies dripped. The policemen and other men carrying the stretchers had no free hands to reach up and wipe away the perspiration that streamed down their crimson faces. The rain dripped into the hold and down the rubber coats of the rescuers. At times it was so still that the feet walking over the boat's side sounded as if we were on the inside of a big bass drum.
On the great drill floor of the 2nd Regiment Armory on Sangamon Street, the dead from the Eastland were assembled for identification. Over 700 bodies were laid out on the floor. Patrol wagons, ambulances, and motor trucks belonging to private firms were continually bringing more. A great crowd packed the streets for 2 blocks in each direction. A double line of policemen drawn around the armory had all it could do to hold back crying, agonized men, women, and children begging to be admitted that they might claim their dead. Sometimes the screams and sobbing of those waiting outside the armory penetrated to the interior of the building, in spite of the solid brick walls. The New York Times.
In one corner, arc lamps shed a brilliant light under which 40 undertakers embalmed the bodies in the unrefrigerated room. Volunteers put victims' personal effects, jewelry, wallets, and watches into envelopes and numbered them to agree with the wrist or toe tag.
They laid the bodies out in rows of 85 over there. Think about, you don't know where somebody is. Think about being the widow who's home with the children, having to come and look for your husband in row after row after row of bodies, over 800. And the other thing that was so frightening, they had no particular record-keeping system. So a family might know that their cousin or their sister was on the Eastland, but they had no way of knowing whether they had gone down in the Eastland or had been able to get themselves off the Eastland.
A man in overalls, who was thought to be one of the electricians at work putting in the emergency lights, suddenly burst into hysterical sobs and sank by the side of a young woman who had just been brought back from the embalmer's table. The black-haired, pretty girl, wrapped in a shroud, was his wife. The New York Times.
Usha, her mother-in-law, went to the armory, and when she saw Sabina, became hysterical. And an official came and said she would have to calm down or they would have to take her out. So she regained her composure. And it was finally over.
At St. Mary's of Czestochowa Catholic Church on 49th Avenue, 29 coffins, so many that they rested some of them across the tops of pews, marked a single funeral mass. At the Masons Hall on Oakley Avenue, the bodies of George Sindelar's entire family of 7 and that of his sister-in-law, 8 caskets in all, were piled on top of one hearse. The Sindelars were one of 22 entire families wiped out.
For this family, it just ended that day. There is a hole in our lives just because they died so young, and it was the whole family. Josephine Sindler, the wife of George Sindler, was wearing a watch around her neck when she died. This watch was then given to my great-great-grandmother, who has handed it down to all the women in the family. It's what keeps the story alive for our family. I think if it were not for this watch, possibly I would not even know about the Eastland.
In the disaster, 175 women lost their husbands. 85 men lost their wives. Parents aboard the Eastland lost a total of 290 children. But for several days, no one came to claim the body of 7-year-old William Novotny.
He was known only as number 396, and what had happened is the city had rallied around this young boy, and the Cub Scouts took this young boy under their wing, so to speak, because they thought they were going to be responsible for his funeral. And the reason nobody came to claim him is because his whole family, perished.
Novotny's funeral, 7 days after the disaster, was held at Bohemian School, where he was a pupil. It became a memorial service to all of the children who died on the Eastland.
Cicero was all but wiped out. I mean, nobody was able to go to work. There wasn't anybody to go to work. It wasn't just Cicero, it was Berwyn. It was the west side of Chicago.
Years ago, when a person passed away, the services were held in the homes. So on each house where there was a dead person, they had what they called crepes. And they consisted of a spray of flowers and a ribbon. Well, if you walk down the street, probably every third, maybe 5th house would have these crepes.
My mother's family door had a wreath and was the only one that had 4 caskets in the parlor.
Colin Avenue, 2 blocks from the Western Electric Company, is a street of weeping and distress. In that part of the avenue nearest the plant, almost all of the houses are occupied by workers at the Western. And there are not many houses in that vicinity into which the Eastland catastrophe has not directly reached. In one house that was occupied by 2 large families, not a light was burning last night. No one had seen any of the occupants of that house yesterday, and it was believed that the disaster wiped out the 2 families. In the houses where no one was directly affected, the time is taken in caring for the stricken relatives, and a pall of general grief hangs over the entire neighborhood. Chicago Daily Tribune.
Can you imagine the number of funerals that had to happen? 844 bodies? The funerals would have been held in the homes because that was the way they had done traditionally. Even with the Catholics, the wakes would have been in the home. This is where the concept of a funeral parlor and everybody came and they viewed the body. These were open caskets, you viewed the body. Processions of neighbors going from house to house to pay their respects.
There were more funerals than hearses. Marshall Field and Company provided 39 delivery trucks to carry caskets as well as mourners. Western Electric volunteered all of its vehicles.
The most incredible thing, though, was a man who was going to be the mayor of Chicago, Anton J. Cermak, was chief bailiff. And he had access to all kinds of equipment through the courts. He used it to get the mourners and the flowers to many of the cemeteries. He was not the only hero in the Bohemian community, but at that moment he was the person who came through when help was needed more than anything else.
Some morticians on the west side, however, were accused of doubling and in some cases tripling the prices of their coffins. At cemeteries like Concordia, Bohemian National, Resurrection, and St. Adelbert's, as many as 30 funeral processions a day passed through their gates.
The bell tower was ringing every 15 or 20 minutes, tolling another life gone.
A ledger at Concordia Cemetery lists 65 victims. All met death at the same place, the same day. Like many others, Arthur Boyga, a Western Electric employee, drowned. A picture of the Eastland was etched into his headstone. 16-year-old Ella Salmon had been employed at Western Electric just 5 weeks. She and her sister Leona supported their widowed mother, Elizabeth.
The shortage of caskets in which to place the bodies caused delays in funeral arrangements. Undertakers were taxed to their utmost to accommodate all who applied, and most of them worked night and day. Chicago Daily Tribune.
Back then it was all done by shovel. It would take 2 men 4 hours each to dig one grave in our cemetery, one working at the foot end and one working at the head end. The crew at that time was probably about 60 people, but those 60 people did 2 burials a day.
Horse-drawn carriages bearing mourners entered the great stone gates of Bohemian National. Here, the body of Willie Novotny was reunited with those of his family. Workers at the newly opened Section 16 were overwhelmed with 139 victims, more than at any other cemetery. They included Mary Antoinette and Julia Zastera, the 3 sisters who had gone down to the docks ahead of their friend Josephine Polivka. 22-year-old William Sherry and 18-year-old Emily Somick were engaged to be married. He worked on the L. She was a Western Electric switchboard operator whose wages supported her sick father, her mother, 3 sisters, and a brother. They were found in each other's arms at the bottom of the hall. And all 7 members of the Sindelar family were buried together: George, Josephina, Adela, Sylvia, George Jr., Albert, and William. A few feet away, Josephina's sister, Regina Dolezal.
A funeral in many families is a terrible financial burden. And when you have, I mean, for instance, with the Sindelar family, where you have 8 members all at one time, who's going to pick up the bill for 8 members of one family?
First you have to take care of getting them buried and whatnot, and settling affairs and going through their personal things, the selling of the house. Financially, it was a burden, although Western Electric and some other organizations helped out financially in a lot of ways.
It was incredible what Western Electric did during this tragedy. They provided financial help. They helped with the funerals. They didn't ask the people if they want help. They just stepped in and gave them help.
Western Electric provided $181,000 in death benefits, 6 months' pay if an employee had worked up to 10 years with the company, and a year's pay for those who had been employed longer. The Red Cross allocated $200 for each adult lost, $150 for each child. Widows received $500. And children who'd lost both their parents received $12 per month until age 16, which then was considered working age. Chicago Mayor William Big Bill Thompson was in San Francisco when the Eastland capsized. He boarded a train and returned to face a catastrophe that had just killed more people than the Great Chicago Fire. In his absence, acting Mayor William R. Morehouse called together 50 of Chicago's most prominent citizens to spearhead relief efforts. The heads of Sears Roebuck and Marshall Field raised $200,000 in 48 hours. Contributions from Charles Comiskey, the employees of Carson Peary Scott, Spiegel, and Quaker Oats nearly doubled that amount over the next 2 weeks. An official day of mourning was declared. At Comiskey Park, the Chicago White Sox canceled their baseball games with the New York Yankees. And in the low-slung bungalows in and around Cicero, survivors told their families of how they had cheated death that day.
My aunt was very fussy about her hair and what she looked like, and so she took quite a bit of time to get herself ready for this big venture. So consequently, they were late, and they got to the dock 2 minutes after the Eastland had tipped over. They just missed getting on the Eastland. Well, my uncle, he said to her, "I'm never going to criticize you for taking time to fix your hair." He said, "After this, you take as much time as you'd like."
George Halas was in fact going to attend the Western Electric picnic that morning. He had tickets, he played as part of the sports teams. He was a summer hire while he was going to college, and he worked at Western Electric.
But the young George Halas, who would become the legendary founder and coach of the Chicago Bears and one of the founders of the National Football League, was running late that morning. He narrowly missed the Eastland. For several days, a grimy steel carcass lay in the mud, blocking half of the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle streets. Ashes from the fireboxes of tugboats had been spread across the hull to provide traction for survivors walking to safety. The greasy water line split the Eastland in two as the ship rested in 19 feet of water, exactly half the ship's width. Lights hung from poles above her, like a grotesque string of pearls. Recovery crews worked 3 straight days and nights, pulling out victims. But salvage was difficult. The Eastland had rolled too close to the wharf for recovery vessels to flank the ship. Engineers came up with a complex plan to raise the Eastland. First, the Eastland's stacks, masts, and unused lifeboats were removed. The holes rescuers had cut were covered and welded shut. Engineers hoped anchor cables would hold the tugboat Favorite in place. While a crane aboard the tug lifted the ship, the plan counted on divers to wrap cables from the tug and land around the Eastland's hull to pull the 1,200-ton ship upright. City Harbor Master Adam Weckler suspended all traffic on the river for 12 hours while the Eastland was raised. He and others suspected they would find more victims beneath the wreckage. A barge loaded with coffins stood by, but no one else was found.
She was born a greyhound and died a wolf. Sidney Jenks, Eastland designer.
Litigation after the Eastland disaster lasted 20 years. It began quickly enough on the Clark Street docks after Captain Peterson's confrontation with ironworkers cutting holes in his ship.
The crew was arrested, and so was the captain. The captain was released, and he went home with his uniform on. And when he did that, the mob was already outside the jail waiting for him. They were going to drag him away and take care of him, and then he ran back into the police department, changed his clothes so people wouldn't recognize who he was.
But soon, Peterson's name and picture were in every newspaper, and he quickly found himself on trial.
Let no one go until we fix the blame on this tragedy. Maclay Hoyne, State's Attorney.
State and federal grand juries indicted Captain Peterson, Chief Engineer Erickson, officials of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, and Steamboat Inspector Robert Reed. Federal Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis ordered a warrant for their arrest. The defendants were charged with conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. Defense attorney Clarence Darrow claimed that a submerged piling had nudged the ship over. No evidence of conspiracy was found. The men were freed. Political cartoons lampooned the trial that many called a whitewash.
Without a doubt, no one conspired to cause the Eastland disaster, so the resulting verdict had to be not guilty.
A civil trial followed on behalf of the victims' heirs. At its conclusion, only Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson was found guilty of negligence. Maritime law limited the payout to the value of the Eastland's hull, appraised at $46,000. But the law also stipulated that creditors be paid first.
They had to pay the company that raised the Eastland from the Chicago River, which approximately was about $35,000. They had to pay the coal company, the concession companies. All these other creditors had to be paid prior to the victims' families. The owners of the ship, the company itself, never really paid a dime, and actually they went out of business shortly afterward.
Joseph Erickson joined the Army and served in World War I as a chief engineer aboard transport ships. He died of a heart condition in 1919. Robert Reed, the inspector who had certified the Eastland to carry 2,500 passengers, died in 1922. William Hull, vice president of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, feared further prosecution if he stayed in Chicago. He died a banker in St. Joseph in 1933. Captain Harry Peterson retired to his farm in Millburg, Michigan. He never captained a passenger ship again. He died in 1939. None of the men served any prison time or paid any fine. The Eastland never sailed again as a passenger ship, but she outlasted most of the people from her past. She underwent extensive repairs that radically changed her appearance and intended use. In 1920, she returned to active service as a training gunboat for the Illinois Naval Reserve. She was renamed the Wilmette. Chicagoans saw her frequently along the lakefront, outfitted with 4-inch guns.
The boat will make a fine training ship for the reserve. There's nothing radically wrong with the hull. The Eastland hoodoo will be broken, and the boat will prove to be a speedy and serviceable craft. It's a question of feasibility, not sentiment. Captain Edward A. Evers, Illinois Naval Reserve.
The Eastland disaster left behind a legacy, one that is applied to every passenger ship in the United States. Prior to the disaster, stability tests had been optional, but after the Eastland rolled over, inspectors made these tests mandatory.
If it was going to be operated with that many lifeboats, that many life rafts, and that many passengers, there should have been some assertion of the stability.
These tests are still done today to limit the number of passengers a ship can carry. Concern about overloading passenger boats was an issue facing Congress before the catastrophe, but lawmakers did not act until after 844 people lost their lives. After the war in 1946, the Wilmette was no longer needed by the Navy. She was sold for scrap and slowly towed upriver, past this very point where, as the Eastland, years before, she had killed so many. A plaque was erected on the site in 1989. But so far, local historical groups have been unable to secure a permanent Eastland museum dedicated to the victims and heroes of that misty summer morning in 1915. For Chicago Stories, I'm John Calloway. Thank you and good night.